Good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello to everyone that may be watching the replay. Welcome to another one of our online learning webinars. This time it's all about the recent joint statement from RICS, Historic England and the Property Care Association, the implications of investigating moisture in traditional buildings. I'm your host, Andy Ferguson, and today I'm pleased to welcome back PCA's Technical Manager, James Berry. We are about to start. For the large amount of you that have just joined us that I can see, if you do want to pose a question over the course of the webinar, feel free, just use the chat facility in the desktop on the left and the right-hand side. If you are on a mobile, you just need to pull it up and you'll see the comment facility there for yourself. Alternatively, you can just email me direct at andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org. Well, James, I can see we are nicely bang on 9 o'clock. So this joint statement, it was a big topic at the International Property Care Conference, jointly presented by Duncan Phillips of RICS, Nicola Lauder of Historic England, and yourself. I mentioned it just there. There is quite a few people from the conference that are tuned in. But for those that may or may not have read the new statement document, what exactly is this uniformed approach to what we're calling the new investigation of dampness within traditional buildings? What is the big shift? And how does this joint agreement affect and shape what surveyors, property professionals, and even our PCA members do when investigating dampness? Now, I know there's some big questions there, and you're following off the back of an extremely popular presentation at the conference. So I suppose over to yourself, good sir.
Thank you very much. What an introduction that was. So, yes, good morning. Let's do that. Brian Hindle calling us all damp junkies. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult, but there we are. I've never been called that before. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Looks like there's a good mix of you. Looks like there's a lot of members, a lot of non-members, and a lot of names that I didn't recognise there, which is fantastic. We always like that. So you're obviously all here to find out about the JPS 22, as we are now calling it. Apparently, it's the joint position statement, which is a collaboration between the Property Care Association, Historic England, and RICS. It was, as has already been alluded to, launched at the conference last week. Now, I'm sure many of you are already aware that actually it's been kicking about in draft format for much longer than that. We've had it on our PCA website, the draft for at least the last 3 years. So in some regards, it's not a new document, but it did get its sort of formal launch in its sort of, let's say, its current final format at the conference last week. It's a pretty short document. It's not a long read by any means. You could probably read it 3 times over by the time we finish this webinar. But I'm told sizes and everything, and it is a pretty significant document. The reason it is such an important document is it's the first time we've had this unique collaboration between sort of the 3 authors that we've already described, where they've reached a consensus as to what the principles and competencies should be when you're looking at moisture in traditional buildings. Not only has it got those sort of 3 authors on the front, but there's also additional levels of endorsement as well. So it's been endorsed, I believe, by all of the major heritage bodies from the home nations. It's got endorsement from SPAB, Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, IHBC as well. So there's a huge amount of support for this document. However, with all that in mind, you will not find a single author's name on that document. And my understanding is that is quite intentional. The reason they've done that is they want this document to belong to everyone. No one sort of those groups should take ownership of this. It should be available, accessible to absolutely everyone to adopt. To that effect as well, If you're a surveyor, you should be able to pick this up. If you're a homeowner, you should be able to pick this up. Or if you're a contractor, you should be able to pick this document up, read it, and be able to digest it. That's why it's so short, because it is meant to be for everyone. You know, if it's too overwhelming, then it doesn't achieve its objective. It is also completely free as well. There is no profiteering involved in this document. It's not a money-making scheme. It is solely there to try and improve the standards of damp investigations. So there's a very noble cause behind this. And I'm hoping, as I say, it's completely free. You can probably download it from any of the websites of the people involved. But I'm hoping my esteemed colleague Andy is going to be dropping it in a link in the comments if he's not already done so. So if you haven't downloaded a copy, download it there, but please wait to the end to read it. But it's not, it's completely free. Go and get your copy now. It was launched at the conference last week. It does seem that some of you are suckers for punishment and want to listen to me twice, so more for you. You know, that's your own punishment, really. But there will be some overlap. Obviously, this is a much longer version, so we won't be looking solely at the implications. We'll be looking at some of the content of the document as well. But just to give you a bit of a perspective as to where I'm coming from this, I wasn't involved in the drafting of the document, but I will be sort of chiefly tasked with getting this rolled out to our members and trying to get our boys and girls to implement this into their day-to-day operations for those that don't already do so. And you know, we'll get into that in more detail anyway. So moving on, the document itself, the way I see it, has three main aims, and arguably one leads to the other two. As I've already sort of suggested, this is about getting diagnostics right. This is to try and help people get to the root cause of dampness in buildings. Why is that important? Well, if you get the diagnostics right, you're going to get the treatment right if treatment is needed. Why is that important? Well, that means if we can get that diagnosis right, if we can establish whether any work is needed, then we can protect our built heritage. If there are older buildings that we do not need to do unnecessary works to, then we shouldn't be doing them. I don't think, you know, there's much disagreement on that. And of course, the other people that benefit from all this, if we can protect people from unnecessary works, then the main group that benefits the most, in my eyes, is the consumer. So this is just professionally and ethically the right thing to do. I, you know, wholeheartedly, I said this at the conference and I say it again now, I very much doubt that there's anybody tuning in today that would disagree with any of those points and not sort of see the benefit in them. So it is absolutely a worthwhile thing to be promoting and to be involved in, as far as I see. So the scope of the document. The document is about traditional buildings. It is there in the title. So personally, I'm not a lover of the term traditional buildings. You know, I think you could live in a building that's 100 years old, brick and tile construction, and, you know, probably not too dissimilar to 2/3 of the UK building stock. And, you know, it doesn't fall within the scope, but it does give us actually quite a nice definition as to what it considers a traditional building to be. And it says it's something that's solid wall built with permeable materials, brick, stone, earth, timber, and lime-based mortars, renders, etc. So that is a pretty neat definition. You know, it gives us a pretty good steer as to where this document is sort of focusing. However, that said, do I think this document is applicable only to them? Well, truth be told, no, I don't. If you're looking at something from, you know, the 15th century, 1915, or even 2015, if you follow the principles set out in this document, it's going to put you in pretty good stead to get to the root cause of the problem. So there is still merit in this document, even if you're not looking at a traditional building. And likewise as well, when the draft was written for this document, it was very much about or aimed and focused at the pre-acquisition survey. They have now realised that this document has merit beyond just those doing sort of the pre-purchase surveys. But if you're looking at any sort of damp related defect, there is merit in this document for you, as because at the end of the day, good practice is just good practice. So if you're following what is set out in this document, it's going to put you in pretty good stead. So whilst this document sort of has traditional buildings as the title, I genuinely believe that the value of it goes well beyond that. And with that in mind, is part of the reason why, we are supporting it. I've already sort of touched on some of the reasons as to why I believe this document has value, but to give it a bit more background, and particularly from the point of view of the association as well. If you start thinking about where the association has come from, we are rapidly approaching our centennial year. But if you look sort of our early days, we were based around sort of wood protection. We were looking to try and preserve the original building materials that were put in situ. That is our heritage. That's where we come from. So actually preserving, our historic building stock is what we do. There is no sort of, there's no conflict in that regard. But the reason, we are rapidly approaching, our 100th year is because we have always strived to promote best practice. Now, if this is what the wider industry now perceives as best practice, then I think it's only right for us as an association to pick up the ball and run with that, and then seize the opportunity, because we're the ones that want to promote best practice, and if this is what it's deemed as, then we should be seeking that opportunity. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is boys and girls of the association, their bread and butter is damp and timber surveys. They are doing, probably 2-3 surveys a day where they're looking at dampness in buildings. We are doing this more regularly than anybody else. So by default, we will be judged by the content of this document more than anyone else. So it just makes sense to embrace it. So it's only right for the PCA to adopt this document as far as I see. How will we go about adopting? Well, truth be told, I think we already have. I think we did a number of years ago. It started with the changes to the Code of Practice. In 2017, we had a complete rewrite of the Code of Practice, which is sort of the principles that we have to stick to for that sector. And we changed it to ensure that it had a more holistic approach to moisture in building. It covered just about every form of dampness that you're likely to encounter. The onus was certainly placed on diagnostics to ensure that, it's not just about treatment, but it's about getting that front end stuff right, because then the tail end follows. So we have certainly sort of led the way in that regard. That then was followed by changes to the CSRT qualification, our sector qualification. So that went from the certificated surveyor in remedial treatments, and then was superseded by the certificated surveyor in timber and dampness in buildings. Again, obviously the treatment has gone with the balance has been tipped firmly towards the more diagnostic side. Again, that was done to try and reflect all forms of moisture in buildings, and certainly with regards to things like condensation, which is certainly the most common form of moisture in buildings, and looks likely to set increasingly so. So it was only right to look to adopt that. And if you were to look at the syllabus for the CSTDB and compare it to the joint statement, you'll actually see that they are very, very similar documents. They are not poles apart by any means. They are certainly singing from the same song sheet. So I think we are sort of already ahead of the curve in some degree to this. The other thing, or one of the other places where we have started to adopt is within our training as well. Certainly led by the pandemic, we had to adjust and brought a lot of our training online. We now have a lot of online training to offer. A bit of a shameless plug there, I guess, but I'm sure Andy can stick another link in the on the comments for you. But when we developed a lot of this online training, a lot of that was done with the content of the what was the draft methodology at that point in mind, to ensure that it was incorporated. I'm not saying it wasn't before, but it was very much put in mind. And because we're not so confined with time with our online training, we've been able to expand it and delve into certain aspects of that in greater depth than we were previously. The other thing to bear in mind as well, and this was sort of mentioned by Duncan Phillips at the launch last year, and something last week, and something that I wholeheartedly agree with anyway, is there is nothing new within this document. There is nothing you're going to pick up in that document and say, well, that's, you know, that's something new and revolutionary. That doesn't exist. In fact, this was described to me as the new old, I think, you know, someone said to me at last week's conference, and it certainly is. This is based on existing best practice. It's based on the likes of BRE Digest 245. It's based on the likes of BS 6576, of 5250, 7913, documents that are long-standing documents, have been out in industry for a while, and are just good practice. There is nothing new in there in that regard. So with that in mind, do I feel that, you know, there is complete compliance with this document? Is that, you know, with our members and you know, the wider world? Well, no, unfortunately not. I believe we're ahead of the curve in some areas, but I also believe that there is a body of development that we need to do as well. And a lot of that sort of extends around sort of our written correspondence. I believe there's a lot of stuff that we are probably doing, but we don't particularly articulate very well within our reports. A lot of that is around that sort of front end contextual stuff that's sort of detailed in here. And we will look at in more detail very, very soon. But I don't think that's necessarily something that we are particularly good at articulating. The other thing that I don't think we're seeing that often, and you know, some people will be doing it, is this assessment of heritage significance that is required as part of this document. And again, like I say, we will be looking at it in more detail, but that is something that I think will need some adjustment. We are quite fortunate as an association because of the degree of engagement we have with our members. You know, we are very involved. We go out and see our members on a fairly regular basis. We do audits with them. Part of that is looking at the written correspondence that are produced. Our scoring matrix for the audits for all those members that are applicable will change, and it will incorporate some of the aspects of this document that is currently missing. So there will be some development for us to do as well, and we will look to embrace that. So that's a bit of background to the document itself, and a bit on how we will look to implement. Now, I'm going to give myself a short rest and see how, you know, in how much you've brought into the document yet, and see, who's, you know, be honest, who's read the document so far, either in draft form or on its current format, who has read it and, you know, digested the content?
Well, James, here, just to let you know, I've just pushed out the poll here. I'm just going to leave it up for about another 10 seconds or so, just to let people answer. Just to let you know, if it's on a desktop, it should just pop up on your screen. If it's on a mobile, it should be similar, just popping up on your screen. Just leave it on for another 3 seconds or so. So 3, 2, 1, end poll. James, I can tell you it's 50-50. 48% said yes. 52% said no.
Oh, well, you know, I admire your honesty. Very good of you. Like I say, it is out there. It has been out there for a while. It's completely free to download. It will not take you long. You could do it over the course of a cup of coffee, I think. You'll see a lot of it is just good common sense, I think. But there we are. But that's what we're going to go into now, of course. So let's start looking at the actual content of the document itself. So it is a short document. I think it's 15 pages cover to cover. It's not overly prescriptive. It doesn't say you must do this, you must do that. It's not a precise recipe. You know, it's not say you must include this much and a little pinch of that. It's just these sort of overarching sort of principles and considerations that you should be taking into account when doing your damp investigation. And it's split into these sort of 7 main topics: the building, understanding moisture, defects caused by moisture, condition assessment, diagnosis and recommendation, legal requirements and reports. And most of those are relatively self-explanatory, but we will start sort of looking at those in a little bit more detail. But the first one as well is split. So we've got the surroundings, and that is where it starts getting you to consider the difference between sort of old structures and new structures as well. So section 1 of the document is this, the building itself. It gets you to start thinking about context, and it feels to this sort of the current buzzword at the moment, or has been for a couple of years, I guess, this holistic approach to moisture in buildings. It wants you to start thinking about not only the building itself, but its surroundings. It wants you to start thinking about the context of where that building is. So it wants you to start thinking about topography. Topography is obviously the study of land. So it could be, or land features, I should say. So is it on the top of the hill? Is it at the bottom of the hill? Water bodies, that sort of thing. So you've got that example there on that left-hand side. You've obviously got a large water body there, and you've obviously you're halfway up a hill. So that is probably likely to get a bit of a battering from the elements. If you're at the top of the hill, you're obviously going to be prone to wind-driven rain a lot more. If you're at the bottom of the hill, then there's perhaps the risk of surface water runoff, that sort of thing. So there's some considerations there. It wants you to consider ground levels as well. Have you got elevated ground levels and the potential for lateral penetration? It wants you to consider drainage. I consider that sort of twofold, I guess. There's the provision for drains, and the site. Is the site well drained? If you've got a saturated ground surrounding the property, or is it a well free draining site? Is the drainage system doing what it's meant to be and sort of discharging that water before it becomes problematic? Things you should be considering as well. Orientation, again, is relatively self-explanatory. Is it a north facing elevation where you've got your problematic wall, because it's less likely to get the sun, it's going to be colder, it's going to be more prone to condensation and mold growth? Is it a southwesterly elevation that's more likely to take a battering from the wind-driven rain? And on wind-driven rain, it wants you to consider UK weather exposure zones as well. Personally, I don't think any of this is stuff that is new. I genuinely believe this is stuff that most people will do by instinct when they're doing their survey. Where I think that there probably is some falling short, if I want to call it that, is people probably just aren't articulating it very well in the reports. If you're going up to a property and you realise that it's stuck on the top of a hill, and it's getting battered by rain, that's fairly obvious, and you need to make sure that you're including that within your report. On UK weather exposure zones, I'm sure you've already seen this. I know we've flashed this about in previous webinars as well. I said it's from BRE 262, but I think it's actually from BSA 104, Code of Practice for Assessing Exposure of Walls to Wind-Driven Rain. So it's quite a famous, and I think you can get it free in some NHBC documents as well, which are free on their website. So it's easily accessible. But it tells you what the severity of wind-driven rain is in your location. So if you're anywhere along the west coast, you're likely to get a very severe wind-driven rain. If you're in the flats of Cambridgeshire, like where I am now, you're relatively sheltered. And again, this is stuff that you can do probably before you get to site. You're going to know this stuff in the back of your head anyway. Again, it's just making sure that you're following that through within your written correspondence. So that's sort of thinking about the property within its sort of surroundings, but it also wants you to start considering the context of the structure as well. So age of construction are the obvious ones. Is it masonry, is it earth, is it timber, etc.? That's fairly self-explanatory. But it also wants you to start thinking about use and historic and former uses for that property as well. For example, if it's a barn conversion, then it's likely to, particularly if there's animals or a history of animal storage there, then there's a chance that you're going to heavy contaminants, concentration of salt contaminants just through where there's been urine and things like that. The underlying structure may be pretty dry, but it may look wet just because of the result of heavy salting. The photo there is a former workhouse on the outskirts of St Ives in Cambridgeshire, and it has quite a significant salt issue there as well. And understanding the history and the use of the building helps you understand as to what is going on there. It also wants you to start considering alterations and additions as well. And again, this is, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's not rocket science here, but it wants you to start considering things like, has there been the addition of retrofit insulation that may impact the way that building is performing? Has someone done something like put a hard dense cement pointing in there instead of the original line pointing, which might be detriment to the fabric of the building and cause sort of or deformation of the faces of bricks, etc. And these are the sorts of things it wants you to consider, and are fairly standard stuff and straightforward. Section 1B is where it wants you to start considering the difference between old and new. It quite rightly identifies that traditional buildings have a different performance level to new builds, and they were designed in different ways to deal with moisture. I think perhaps in my own opinion, where this document could do with a bit of development is that not everybody that occupies those buildings necessarily does so out of choice. And whilst older buildings do not perform at the same level, either thermally or in a moisture regards, as well as its more modern counterparts, the simple reality is, in many instances, those that occupy those buildings still expect a modern performance level. And they are definitely expecting that in light of the current fuel and climate crisis. And perhaps if we see later versions of this document, it'd be quite cool to see them sort of try and sort of embrace that a bit more. Moving on then, so that's section 2 now is understanding moisture. It kind of is what it says on the tin. I can't really say much more than that. It wants you to understand the mechanics of moisture and how it interacts with building materials. It wants you to understand concepts such as capillarity, porosity, permeability, and it also wants you to consider all the possible sources of moisture as well. So external sources of moisture, essentially rainwater. It wants you to consider internal sources of moisture, which is what we've got a nice picture of there. Groundwater, so capillary rise or lateral penetration, whatever it may be. Surfaces, of course, leaks and drains. These are all, we all know this. This is straightforward stuff. It also wants you to understand about the moisture from human production and how the balance between ventilation, moisture production and heating are all interrelated. We could go into that now, but we don't need to, because that is very well covered in other webinars. We've covered ventilation in a huge amount of detail. And again, another shameless plug, but we do have a huge suite of CPD available on YouTube, where all our former webinars are. So if you are interested in that, go and check it out. It also tells us that there is an array of instruments or locating and measuring devices for moisture, as it calls it, that we should have an understanding of. And I think we should probably make this a pop quiz, shouldn't we? Who can name all of those? No prizes, of course, but you get to have a certain amount of prime. Can you name what all of those are? And who's got every single one of them? That's not an exclusive list. There are a few more, but we will start touching on those in a bit more detail. So the staple, I guess, for everyone is the moisture meter, which is that bottom center right, is the default for most surveyors. We've all got one, but we also know that they have very serious limitations. They are very, very useful. They are great for sort of building up a quick indication of distribution of moisture, but they have their flaws. I have heard it said that these are what has instigated this document to some degree, but I don't think anyone has ever been under any illusions that, you know, they're the panacea. I think, you know, we've got a document that's probably, it has recently been revised, but our moisture meter document is probably 30 years old, and it is a great insight into the limitations and the advantages of electronic moisture meters. So Andy, sorry, if you're there, you might need to put that one in the comments as well. But some of the other equipment it tells you to be able to use, a thermal imaging camera. Of course, a thermal imaging camera can't tell you anything to do with moisture. It doesn't tell you where moisture is. It tells you where there's temperature differentials, which may result in cold bridges or areas. It could tell you where condensation might be occurring, but they're very good for identifying cold bridges as well. The other one, data loggers we've got there. For anybody that's not familiar with data loggers, they are a very useful tool to help you find or establish what is going on beyond the course of your initial survey. Obviously, when you're there, it's normally a snapshot survey. You can understand the conditions when you're there. These can be left in situ to help you understand what the ambient conditions are, so moisture content of the air, dew point, that sort of thing. So particularly if you've got occupied properties where you turn up and the windows are open, this helps you to establish well beyond the context of that initial visit. Another bit of kit there is an anemometer, which I genuinely believe for anyone that's looking in dampness in buildings, that should be, you know, as important as your moisture meter, particularly if you're looking at more modern buildings where you've got an extractor fan. And anemometer is there to help you establish flow rates for extractor fans. You know, we've seen a lot that are there, make a lot of noise, but don't really do a lot. This will help you establish whether you've got a good and functioning ventilation system. So that's a powered hood one. That's probably a high-end model, but you can get sort of cheaper equivalents that will help you out as well. Speedy meters, they will give you a quantitative reading for those that haven't used these before. We're told that we need to know about them. You know, they're destructive. Not everyone wants them, particularly on a pre-acquisition survey. That they're a bit cumbersome to use, and they have their limitations. It's only going to give you total moisture content, you know, and they can be heavily influenced by salts. But again, it's one of the equipment that we're told to use. Then the hygrometer and the surface thermometer there as well. Hopefully you've identified that, the one on the right and the bottom center left. Very useful bits of kit, can help you determine if condensation is happening at the time of survey. The one that I think perhaps might have caught a few of you out, I know I've spoken to, you know, a few of you about it before, is the microwave meter in that bottom left hand corner. We're told we need to understand microwave meters. So my understanding, that is about the only realistically commercially available microwave meter. That is our one. They're not very good in my honest opinion. They will help you understand sort of distribution of moisture, but I don't think that's anything that you can't do with your conventional moisture meter actually. So perhaps it gives you a slightly deeper readings. There may be some merit in that, but it has some drawbacks as well. So if you've got all of them, well done. The obvious omissions on that are, of course, well, dowel pins, if you want to use dowel pins for measuring, and gravimetrics, which is probably the one that's going to give you the most accurate readings, etc. But you know that it's time consuming, and you need the relevant equipment to be able to do it. But with all of these, the one thing to consider is that no single one of these provides all the answers. And I think this is what the document is trying to get at, is that they all have a value, but not one of them is the answer by itself, but they all are, you know, are all good. And the other thing, of course, is they are all only as good as the person that is using them. Because if the person that is using it doesn't know how to interpret the information, then they're all useless or dangerous. So it's important that the person understands what they're using, how they're using it, and the limitations of. So that's under understanding sort of moisture. Section 3 is understanding defects. And again, this is another one that sort of, it is what it says on the tin. It gives us this, causes a deterioration of the building, porous materials. I'm not sure how that, but 3's 4 action is pretty self-explanatory. organic growth, molds, corrosion of metals, rust, that sort of thing. And of course, us as a trade association, which, as I mentioned earlier, is nearly going 100 years, is centered around the preserving in situ timber from insect attack and fungal decay, rot. So, you know, we as a trade association are very familiar with the defects as a result of moisture in the built environment. We're also told to consider a condition assessment. Now, it goes without saying you're going to know if you turn up on a building and then it's pretty run down and derelict or whatever, but it wants you to conduct a thorough inspection to identify possible sources of water ingress and a lack of maintenance and things like that. It wants you to encourage to get that addressed and sort of consider the impact of alterations as well. So this is going back to things like the cement pointing or inappropriate cement pointing that we spoke about earlier. So that's, you know, is fairly self-explanatory. Just assess the condition of the structure. Section 5 is diagnostics and recommendations, and again, it's back to this buzzword, and it wants you to do this holistic diagnostic. So it wants you to deal with the cause rather than the symptom. And the two examples that I can think of with that is, you know, mold growth being one, or condensation. We know that that's caused by high humidities, but there's no point if it's a mold growth issue just wiping off the mold growth, because ultimately you're not dealing with the issue. What you need to be considering is how is that building able to deal with the excessive moisture, or is it excessive moisture production? Is it inadequate heat? And giving it a bit more down. So actually using some of that equipment that we looked at earlier to try and get to the sort of the root cause of the issue as to what might be causing the issues. The other one might be higher ground levels. So it may be that you've got elevated ground levels, and rather than being able to drop the ground, which is obviously the best answer, if you can do that, you're dealing with the cause. However, in reality, we know, you know, it could be a public highway or whatever, you know, high ground levels that you just can't change. So ideally, you want to be dealing with the high ground levels, reducing where you can, but, you know, in the vast majority of instances, you can't. Identify where further investigation may be needed is also encouraged. Now, that's great, but we've got to appreciate that the client doesn't always want to hear that more investigation is required. If you're there, they're employing you, and you know, this is encouraging a lot of diagnostics. You know, if you want to then turn around and say, well, we need to do a bit more, it's not going to be favourable in their eyes, but unfortunately, it's going to be inevitable, and we shouldn't be afraid to do it. And this one, I don't think anyone is going to have too much sort of disagreement with, but consider the options for repair that minimize the impact of heritage value. Now, I deliberately chose that value, the picture we've got there. I mean, thankfully, we've moved on from days like that, but we've got, you know, a fairly historic form of remedial damp-proof course put in there, and the problem is that, you know, that you know, let's be honest, it does leave visual scarring. That's going to be there forever. Thankfully, now modern methods don't do that, and you know, you try and think about how you might get away from that. Could things be done internally if there is sort of that works of that nature that need to be done? So yeah, it kind of is common sense stuff. I already alluded to the fact that this document is, and throughout this document, really, that it's sort of, there's a lot of areas that overlap in all of the sections, but I'm picking up here is determining heritage significance. It wants us to do an assessment of heritage significance. Now, I put these two structures on here because these are two that are very, very close to me. They're probably within sort of 3 miles of where I'm sat now. They're both sort of Cambridgeshire brick. They're not too dissimilar in styles, but I would argue that the one on the right has more sort of heritage value, partly because that is more in keeping with the surrounding area, but it also retains a lot of the original features as well. You've got the original sash, whereas on the right you've got the where, you know, the UPVC windows, and then it's sort of been bricked above it, and it's lost a lot of that aesthetic appeal. Now, we're told that Well, this is something that was discussed at the conference last week. We had Professor John Edwards give a very interesting presentation on the topic. He told us that it's very subjective, but there are essentially 4 values that we should be considering when we're looking at heritage significance. That's aesthetics, the communal value, the evidential value, and historical value. It's something I'm keen for us to try and sort of cover in more detail in future sort of training courses, wherever it may be. The reason for the apple and orange, of course, is are we comparing apples with apples or apples and oranges? So, I think it is very subjective. We need to be careful. And the other thing to bear in mind, and as we learned, or we are aware, it can vary within the building as well. So the front may have more heritage value than the rear of the property. So what does a heritage value assessment looks like? Well, this is something that was sort of proposed as a relatively simplistic version of one to do. It's fairly self-explanatory. This is from a CADAL document, heritage impact assessment in Wales, and that's the sort of thing I think we should be looking for. So that's what it looks like. It's fairly straightforward, and of course it should be proportionate. Stately homes are one thing. You're going to be doing something that's a lot more comprehensive than that. A fairly conventional 2 up, 2 down, then you're probably not. Moving on from that then, because I have had my warning that we're slowly running out of time, or quickly running out of time. Section 6 is the legal requirements, and this is where it gets you to think about things that you've been thinking about day in, day out anyway. Things like the Party Wall Act, things like CDM regs, all the health and safety legislation. And again, apologies for probably teaching Granny to suck eggs, but it wants you, it doesn't change anything with regards to legally protected and listed buildings. Everything as far as they are concerned stays the same. You still have to follow the same legislation as you always had to do. So this document doesn't change anything on that regard. You still need to do a heritage impact assessment for listed buildings, and you still need to be able to justify the works. So in that regard, if you're looking at a listed building, the game hasn't changed at all. Section 7 is reports. I sit in a bit of a privileged position where I get to see a lot of damp and timber reports. So this is sort of a bit from my experience on areas where I think we need to start including that we probably aren't already. A lot of it, as I've already alluded to, is around that front end stuff, the contextual stuff, particularly not just the property, but the setting of the property. So things like the topography, the ground conditions, the drainage, the orientation, UK weather zones. And again, the context, the age and structure, I think everyone's doing, but the past use. And that might involve an element of occupier engagement as well. Try and get a bit of the history from them, making sure that you're, engaging with them, finding out if they know something. They might be able to tell you if there's been a flood. And that might actually influence your assessment of the building. Condition of the building, I think we're doing that to a degree, but I think we could perhaps summarize a bit better. Alterations and additions, again, I think most are doing it, but there are some that need to ensure that they're including that. Heritage significance, I think that some of you are doing, but I think the document says we should be doing in all instances. And legal protection status, whether it's legal protected or not. So the one thing, or another thing that this document gets us to consider, particularly at the report stage, is it wants us to consider providing the client with alternative options. So if there are more than one way to skin a cat, provide them the advantages and disadvantages of the different options, and that includes time and cost. If there is sort of several options to, the remediation, it wants you to try and prioritize those solutions as well. So if you want to try and do one thing and let the structure dry down, then absolutely that should be encouraged and sort of explained to them and prioritized. The other thing, and this has been something that has been discussed for a little while, is this start of longer term relationships. Now, it's something I know Steve has discussed before, and there is sort of this reliance on guarantees, and wouldn't it be nice to sort of move away from that and just have these longer term relationships where damp could be dealt with as sort of a phased process. A lot of damp issues can be complex, and if you're afforded the time, then you can take it one step at a time, you know, with monitoring periods and dealing with sort of the obvious first and working back. That would be lovely. Wouldn't that be great? But unfortunately, we must, you know, accept the reality in a lot of instances. If we are to say, well, we want to do this, that we want to let it dry down, and then we want to try this next step and see how we get on. But ultimately, you know, you've just brought your new dream house, but it's going to be another 5-6 years before you can go and slap your Farrow and Ball paint on the wall. You know, they're not going to be entirely happy with that, and that's a reality we're going to have to accept as well. But in some situations, this is absolutely, you know, if we can take this sort of longer term approach, then there is absolutely merit to it. The document also talks about unnecessary works and acting in an impartial way. By that, it means you shouldn't be exaggerating any specification for repair. The work should be proportionate to the defect. So if it's a relatively minor defect, the work should be relatively minor. You must minimize the impact on heritage value and significance. Again, it's self-explanatory now. Don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You know, if you can get away with a relatively minor repair, particularly on a heritage structure, then that should be where we go. And the other thing to bear in mind, you know, as far as members of the association go, that is nothing new. That has been embedded in the code of ethics for members of the association for as long as I am aware. You know, works have got to be proportionate, and you should not be making up works that aren't required. And we have taken action and disciplined members as a result of that. So as far as that's concerned, there are no changes. So Andy, I'm on to my final slide, so don't fret. I think we're pretty close to time. But for anyone that has seen any of the additional marketing, you know, out there around the joint position statement, they have very much made out that this is hopefully the start of possible future collaborations. You know, that is what is great about this document, is that it brought everyone together. And we look at what joins us rather than pulls us apart. We are more likely to progress than what we are if we sort of all sit in our separate silos. And it is great to try and work together, because ultimately, if we can improve the standards in industry, the people that benefit the most is the consumer. And I don't think anyone can disagree that that is a valid thing to do. I also mentioned at the start that I saw this as sort of a continuation of best practice. You know, this is what the wider industry now accepts as best practice. Best practice can never remain static. It will always evolve. You know, where we were 10 years ago is certainly not where we are now. It will always have to change. And this is just a continuation of that. The other thing I am certainly not naive to, and it sort of, I saw unfortunately a comment on a social media post last night, and it sort of really re-emphasized the point with me. We as an association do not cover all of this sector by any means. In fact, I'll be surprised if we cover even half of it. There is a world beyond sort of what the associate or members of the association. However, what I do know is that members of the association are those that want to be the best in industry, and I have no doubt that they're going to be the ones that want to try and adopt the guidance that's accepted in this or put out in this. And what that means is, if we can do that, if we can embrace this, we can then have sort of we can signpost consumers to those that are willing to do that. And we can give them that element of consumer protection as well, and that provides that element of consumer reassurance as well. Don't get me wrong, you know, I'm aware that particularly around the context and things like that, this is probably going to mean that some reports will need to longer, and that there will be a time aspect involved in that. But actually, that's something we have to accept, and that, you know, should be reflected in the cost for the survey that you're doing. Consumers should be expected to pay for a professional service at the end of the day. And that is me. You know, thank you for putting up with my long monologue for, you know, the best part of 45 minutes. I don't think there is anything particularly new in the document. It's all common sense stuff. Thank you very much.
No, well, no, thank you, James, and thanks for going through that. I will definitely say this. Certainly when you were talking about all the measurement devices, the chat certainly did open up. Now, just to let you know, folks, that if you are interested in finding out a bit more, I did post it within the chat. There is that document to the measurement devices and best practice and guidance for using those devices. But also, James has been putting together a little mini series of based on what we're calling our PCA test wall. Now, I've put the link into the chat to that, and within that series, there is actually a particular video where James is actually comparing the different devices and showing you the results that are coming from those devices, which was what James, you did that about 2 months ago, wasn't it? So it's fairly recent.
Say that again, sorry, Andy.
You did that video, what was it, 2 months ago, was it? So it's a fairly recent video.
Which one's that? Sorry.
Oh, the one about your test wall series.
Oh yeah, well there's a few. There's another one which Joey is currently working on, so that will sort of bring the first section of that sort of series to a close. But yeah, the first sort of 3 in the series are very much out there.
All right. Well, James, starting off with the first question, because we spoke a lot about what we're doing. We spoke a lot about the document in itself. I suppose my first question would be about enforcement. I mean, how are the parties that help pull together helping to try and enforce on this document?
Okay, well, I did sort of cover that. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day. Let's be perfectly frank. But we are at an advantage, I think, to everyone else, because we have this level of engagement with our members that is sort of unrivaled. We go out and see them. You know, we are quite happy to have frank and honest conversations with our members. We have this sort of, we sit there, we look at technical correspondence, and, you know, we will help them improve that level. We will improve. We are, you know, changing our scoring matrix, and we will look to try and encourage them through. So do I think it's going to, you know, it's not going to be done tomorrow. You know, we've got to sit in front of these people and you know, we've got to try and encourage this change. But as I alluded to, I genuinely believe that most of our members are those that want to push the boundaries of best practice in industry, and I have no doubt that they will all look to adopt and embrace this where possible. And, you know, as I said, a lot of this isn't new, so a lot of them are already doing it.
Let's tell you what, moving on. And just, folks, just to let you know, if you do have a question, we don't actually have a lot of questions, so if you do want to post something, feel free just to stick it into the chat. But got a question from Sam Costigan. Now, this is actually based on the measuring equipment that we were speaking about earlier. Now, Amy's asking, how important do you deem the type and quality of measuring equipment? Now, he's going on to explain that equipment in the wrong hands can be dangerous and be interpreted incorrectly, which he completely agrees with you. But he finds that some surveyors buy extremely expensive kits that can be the better part of £600 plus, whereas he generally buys the cheaper equipment. What, in your opinion, is that? I mean, do you see a huge difference between the most expensive in the market compared to the cheapest in the market?
Yeah, okay. You know, which one are we looking at? You know, there was, you know, 8 or 9 pieces of equipment that we were looking at there. And it varies for each one. If you're looking at a moisture meter, well, they've all got serious limitations anyway. If you've got you know, some of the high-end ones, they've got some additional features on, you know, where they'll be able to, they've got the surface thermometer and the hygrometer built in. But equally, you could probably pick up those 2 pieces of equipment. I think Audi at one point were selling moisture meters, and they've got the pins, and I think that's a better mode rather than the search mode, which can be a bit deceptive. And if you're only using it on timber anyway, I believe, most of that equipment you could probably get away with sort of some of the lower end, because it is down to the user. There are some advantages to having some of the higher end stuff, and it does tell you more. But, if you're looking at things like that anemometer, we showed the powered hood one, then yeah, absolutely there is advantages to having the high end stuff, because it has sort of different functionality. So it's a hard one because there's so many different bits of kits to be able. But as far as electronic moisture meters, it was on that series that we did recently that you referred to earlier. Actually, they've all got arbitrary scales when it comes to plaster work anyway, but when you stick them in a bit of timber, there ain't a lot of difference between one that's going to cost you probably 20 quid to one that's going to cost you 800 quid. But again, the one that's got 800 quid has probably got a bit more functionality, and means you're carrying around one piece of equipment rather than three. Horses for courses.
Well, Sam, just to let you know, I've just reposted that link into the chat. So yeah, certainly feel free just to kind of click on that link, and you'll actually see James again presenting on the different moisture meters and measuring devices. Next question comes from Brian. I think this might be Brian Hindle. I don't have a surname. But Brian has mentioned that from looking at the document, he sees no direct mention of the term rise and damp. Is there a particular reason for that?
Don't know. I wasn't part of the writing. It tells us to consider groundwater, and if you're considering groundwater, it's either lateral or it's capillary rise, as far as I'm concerned. So no, it doesn't have the term rising damp in there, but like I said at the beginning, I wasn't involved in the drafting. I don't know what discussions were had as to terms that were used. But like it says, it refers you to PCA guidance. It refers you to, BRE guidance and BS guidance, British Standard guidance. And, it's referenced in those. So.
All right. Well, next question from Paul Walker. This is kind of flipping over now to mortgage lenders. How do you think mortgage lenders will react to this document?
I hope they'll embrace it, is what I say, because that improves standards, and that works for everyone. So whether they will or not remains to be seen. That depends how industry reacts to it. If everyone, picks this up and says we should be embracing this and adopting it and running with it, and then they're going to look to do that as well. If everyone just, if this is just dismissed and nothing comes of it, then there's nothing gained. But I don't think. Well, let's see. I can't speak for them. I don't speak on their behalf. But would it be a bad thing if they did turn around and say, well, we want everything to be done to this standard because, well, good. There's it will improve standards.
Okay. Well, moving on. Question from Simon Smith. This is actually to do with terminology that's used. So he's asking, just with the release of this document and greater collaboration between multiple parties, do you think that terminology within the industry will change as a result of this greater collaboration with bodies such as Historic England, such as RICS, STAB, towards damp management? Do you think things would change?
An interesting question.
Yeah.
I would like to see it anyway, and I think that's kind of been the shift as to where we've been going as an association, as an industry anyway. The only reason being, because we get damp-proof courses, it's all about sort of damp-proof courses. But we're kind of moving away from that, and have done, like I say, for a good while now, that it is about all forms of moisture in the built environment. So yes, I would like to see it sort of change from damp proofing to damp management, because it's not just about groundwater. There are, and condensation is of course the most common form of moisture. So yeah, perhaps that wouldn't be a bad change. But yeah, I don't know. It's it's not. I think damp proofing is what it is, isn't it? It's normally.
Well, do you know something? I mean, we don't pretend to have all the answers, and you know, we're very open to opinion. Do you guys feel that it needs to be better?
I would like to see it change because I think we're so much more than that, and I think if we start considering that it sort of ties us into just that one form of moisture in the built environment, it would be great to see us move from that.
Do you know, interestingly, Brian, and I think it is Brian.
Yeah, no, he's right. Yeah, I've just seen that from Brian, and you're right. People
well actually, just before you say, just to put context in here, Brian has suggested Google is the problem. So just in case for those that didn't see the comment, but on you go, James.
Well, no, he's right. That's what I've just seen. And you know, he's right. It's 50 years, 60 years worth of legacy there, if not more, 70 years of where it has been damp proofing, and that's what people are going to search for. But we're a different animal now. There is more, to what we do than just the insertion of remedial damp proof courses.
And Brian, you are correct. As a marketeer, I'm well aware of the number of recorded hits there are against particular terms. Damp proofing by a country mile is without a doubt the number one term associated with our kind of sectors. It is easily 20 times larger in terms of its search compared to any other term. So yes, you do have a very valid point. Google is part of the problem, but it's not necessarily the problem, because it's not Google's fault that people are typing in the word damp proofing. It's the term that's been educated to the homeowners, or the term that they're hearing that they're then physically typing in, that's then resulting in them typing in that damp proofing term, which is then resulting in the results coming back. So I think there's actually, yes, Google is part of the problem, but there is a systematic cultural change in almost the terminology that we need to radiate and ripple out to the professionals, to the estate agents, that then ripple out to homeowners and so on and so forth. But that's not something that will ever change overnight. But folks, I can see I'm very conscious of time. There is one or two questions that we haven't had. On you go, James.
Is there one I can pick up on, which
yes,
is the question from Sam Costigan, which is about gravimetrics and salt. I would extend the arm of friendship to Graham Coleman if I were you, Sam. He would love to know more, or he would more than happily sort of tell you how to do he can facilitate that gravimetrics for you, and he'll give you a protocol as to how those samples can be collected, and he can help you to speak to him, is what I would suggest. That's I'm just keen to pick up on that one.
No, absolutely. And Sam, I know there was a couple of links sent on the YouTube. On the chat there to YouTube. What I'll do is I will follow that up and I'll ping you that link as well, just via to the email, in case you've come off the webinar just at the moment. But folks, just to kind of finish off, if you are looking for additional information, if I can just point you just to a couple of resources just at the back of the PCA website. So, I mean, firstly, to our technical libraries, our damp control library, and our timber preservation library. In addition as well, you can visit the professional section and the training sections of our website. You'll find a whole host of information just in there, and there's also additional webinars, training courses, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. You just simply go to the links either within the slide or the links that I've just sent via the chat. Of course, this webinar will also be available for you to view. That availability won't be until next week, because unfortunately I can't do anything in terms of getting this sorted out for tomorrow. But come Monday, we will email this out to everyone that is registered against the webinar. For those that are interested in learning more, I haven't got all the training courses up here, but there are training courses available, as I alluded to, and as James alluded to, over the course of the webinar. There is our flagship courses, our surveyor training, timber and dampness, both online and classroom based. We do have our more technician stroke tradespeople training courses on timber and dampness. and a whole host of other timber, ventilation and dampness related courses. Simply just go to the link that you can see in the slide. Coming up next, our next webinar, we don't quite have it up yet, but our next webinar will focus all about flooding. It's looking at what surveyors and building professionals should be considering, looking at and reporting on when it comes to surveying properties with property flood resilience measures installed. We should have details up about that from tomorrow. So simply just go to the link that you can see there, and that should be available for registration. Last but not least, I just want to say, firstly, a big thank you to yourself, James, for delivering the presentation and sharing the knowledge that we were sharing last week off the back of the conference. Not only actually sharing the knowledge we shared last week in the back of the conference, but extending on that knowledge for everyone. I just want to say a thank you to everyone that joined us this morning as well and tuned in. And last but not least, I just hopefully everyone has a lovely rest of the morning. So goodbye everyone, and hopefully we see you at the next webinar.